1965 because it sent a message that chilled discussion of issues of this kind for 25 years on American campuses, in American newspapers, by American politicians. They wanted to find anything to help explain educational issues and problems that didn't involve coming back to the issues raised by the Moynihan Report. The second thing happened. Lyndon Johnson was determined that during his time the platform would be built to erase the legacy of slavery and segregation in the United States. That he was going to, first of all, through the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the other Great Society programs, including the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, the Higher Education Act of 1965, Medicare. He was determined to change the face of this country and to redeem itself against what had been practiced for 400 years. And so he launched the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. A lot of money. Federal participation in the budgets of poor school districts went from about 1% to 10% almost overnight. The formula was written to favor districts that had large numbers of poor kids. It tracked poor kids. It was a terribly important initiative. He included a paragraph in that bill because he had his eye looking ahead, and he wanted to be able to make a case after he was reelected. Maybe this was a second-term case he was going to make. He wanted to make a case that the federal government ought to be involved in providing capital funds so that school districts would have the money to build better facilities. A problem with this performance gap was that poor black kids went to schools that didn't have the laboratories, didn't have the libraries, didn't have the facilities required for a decent education. And so he knew that there would be a lot of opposition to this idea. And he wanted to get a blue ribbon commission to basically certify his view that this was terribly important in explaining this achievement gap. And he appointed, this was appointed by the Secretary of HEW at the time, a distinguished commission led by a Johns Hopkins sociologist named James Coleman, and of course the report's name was the Coleman Report. It was the second largest survey ever undertaken in the United States. It was, I think there were hundreds of thousands of kids tested during the time that this was carried out. Thousands of teachers were tested, parents were interviewed. And the Coleman Report came up with 3 findings that were pretty much unexpected, but which confirmed something that we still can talk about today. The first finding was that in explaining the variation in academic performance, the most important explanation comes from the social economic status of the students' parents. If you know that, you have the best predictor of how well kids will do in school. It's not much of a surprise. Confirmed by thousands of tests that were conducted as a part of this report. The second finding, also not expected by the people at the time, was that the second best explanation comes from the social economic status of the kids who go to school. If you know that, then you know a lot more about how well kids are likely to do. The third explanation, and the only other statistically significant explanation, was It depends on the quality of instruction. Also not a surprise. And suddenly what you had was, instead of a statement to support an ambitious program of school construction, you had a lot of people reaching the conclusion that schools made no difference, because it was pretty well set by the social economic status of the parents and who you went to school with. So you combine these two things, a very powerful reluctance to talk about any issues involving race, a confirmation that poverty is the best explanation for the variation in performance. You sort of conflate in everybody's mind that poor equals black, black equals poor, and let's move on. And that mindset had dominated public discussion, as I said, for a quarter of a century. So if you want an explanation about why we have failed, you can start with the fact that we have been defining the problem inaccurately and precisely for a very long time, and refusing to deal in either policy or in practice or what happens in schools with the underlying explanation and problem. So, with all of this, what do we know, and how well do we know it, and what does it suggest for what sensible education policy should look like? We know actually a great deal. As I said, we've had millions of test results, and they keep coming along every 2 years with the National Assessment for Educational Progress. We have SAT scores every year. We have tens of thousands of kindergarten kids given them something like a Peabody vocabulary test every year. We collect mountains and mountains of evidence. And by the way, we collect too much. We don't know how to use it. I think Oscar Wilde defined a cynic as somebody who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. That's a pretty good description of public education. We have more information about more activities and spending and teacher credentials and student outcomes and class size and everything else, but we don't know what to do with it. But we have, I think now, again, sort of undeniable evidence about what works best to deal with this problem. Not surprisingly, it has to do with starting early. Because kids who arrive at kindergarten, who are not able to, don't know the letters, can't count to 30, that is a very powerful predictor of those kids who by third grade are not going to be reading at grade level. If you don't know your letters in kindergarten, you're unlikely to read at grade level in third grade. If you don't read at grade level in third grade, you only have an 11% chance of ever reading at grade level. We're talking about 9-year-old kids. So we have all this evidence that says that you need to act urgently where kids come to kindergarten underprepared in terms of the vocabulary they have, in terms of the general knowledge they have. How much do they know about books? Do they know how to read a book? When you read a book, they're not reading yet. Do they know the stories that sort of dominate American culture? Have they even read those stories? If they haven't, and if they don't have the words, then they have a very difficult time ever finding them on a page, don't they? So we know that if you take poor kids and spend a lot